He wasn't supposed to be here. For years, he had been a force of nature, a partner, a protector. The streets had been his home, the uniformed officers his pack. He had chased down criminals, tracked missing persons, and stood fearless in the face of danger. When the gunfire started, he was the first to move, putting his body between his handler and the threat. That was his purpose. That was who he was. But that life was gone now. One day his handler had taken off his badge, given him one last pat, and walked away. Rex had watched him leave, his ears twitching, waiting for him to return. But he never did. The shelter staff had been kind enough. They fed him, spoke to him in gentle voices, but they didn't understand. They didn't know that every time he heard footsteps outside the kennel, he expected them to be his handlers. That every time the door opened, he turned his head, waiting for a familiar voice that never came. Days passed. Then weeks. People came through looking for dogs to take home. Their eyes would pass over Rex, lingering only for a second before moving on. He wasn't what they wanted. He was too big, too intense. His muscles, though beginning to soften with inactivity, still held the signs of his training. His sharp brown eyes weren't filled with the playful excitement of the others. They were watchful, assessing. He didn't beg for attention, didn't jump at the bars like the others. And so, one by one, other dogs left. Families came in with wide smiles and left with a leash in hand, leading their new companions into a world of soft beds and quiet walks. But not Rex. He was a soldier without a battlefield, a partner without a handler. And worst of all, he was starting to wonder if anyone would ever come for him again. The shelter was never quiet. The barking never stopped. A constant chorus of desperation, excitement, and need. Dogs paced in their kennels, tails wagging when people passed by, hopeful that today would be the day someone picked them. Rex had stopped hoping. He lay in the corner of his kennel, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded, but always watching. His ears flicked with every movement outside, every voice, every footstep. Instinct told him to stay alert. That was what he had been trained to do. Even now, locked behind metal bars, he couldn't turn that part of himself off. Every few days, new faces arrived. Families with children, couples looking for a companion, shelter volunteers leading potential adopters past the rows of dogs. Rex had learned their patterns. He knew the ones who were looking for small, fluffy dogs to cradle in their arms. He knew the ones searching for a playful companion to run in the backyard. And he knew the ones who barely glanced at him before moving on. They always moved on. He wasn't what they wanted. Too big, too serious, too intense. He had seen them hesitate in front of his kennel. Some admired his muscular frame, his sharp features, the way he sat perfectly still, waiting. But then their gazes would flicker to the scars along his side, the discipline in his posture, the piercing intelligence in his amber eyes, and their admiration would turn into uncertainty. This one's a former police dog, a shelter worker would explain. Highly trained, very loyal. But that wasn't what people wanted. They wanted a pet, not a soldier. Some had even tried. A man had stepped up once, looking down at Rex with interest. He had spoken in a light, coaxing tone, clicking his tongue and holding out his hand. Rex hadn't moved. He had only stared. The man had chuckled nervously, stepping back. "Yeah, I don't think he likes me." He had never understood. It wasn't about like or dislike. Rex had been waiting for a command, for orders, for something that made sense. But none ever came. The shelter workers did their best. They gave him food, took him out for walks, spoke to him in soft voices. But they couldn't give him what he had lost. And as the days passed, the glances toward him became less frequent. The worried murmurs between staff grew more urgent. They knew what happened to dogs that stayed too long. And if someone didn't come soon, Rex's time would run out. The precinct was quieter than usual, the low hum of conversation filling the space between ringing phones and the clatter of keyboards. Detective Mark Callahan sat at his desk, sifting through a stack of reports, but his mind wasn't on the words in front of him. It hadn't been for a while. The job had changed over the years, or maybe he had. He had seen too much. Loss, betrayal, lives taken in an instant. But there were some things that never stopped hurting. some partners that couldn't be replaced. "Hey, Callahan," a voice broke through his thoughts. Officer Grant leaned against his desk, holding a coffee cup, his expression casual but knowing. "You ever think about getting another dog?" Mark's fingers stilled around his pen. The question felt heavier than it should have. "You know that's not something I'm looking for," he muttered, not meeting Grant's eyes. Grant sighed, shifting his weight. "There's a dog at the shelter, a former K9. Got dumped there after retirement. No one's taking him." Mark's jaw tightened. He hadn't worked with a K9 in years, not since his own partner Duke had passed. That wound had never fully healed, and he had told himself it wasn't something he'd go through again. But something in Grant's voice made him look up. "Why?" Mark asked, his voice gruff. Grant hesitated before answering. "Because he's not just any dog. He was trained for the job, same as Duke, and he's been sitting there waiting. But no one wants him." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't need this. He didn't need another reason to get lost in memories of the past. But the thought of a K9, trained, disciplined, abandoned, something about it didn't sit right. "What's his name?" "Rex." The name struck something deep, something unspoken. Mark had seen it before. Good dogs left behind because they were too much, too trained, too disciplined for people who just wanted a pet. Mark exhaled slowly. He had no plans of bringing another dog into his life, but maybe, just maybe, he could go take a look, just to see. He stood up, grabbing his jacket. Grant smirked. "Didn't think you'd go soft on me, Callahan." Mark shot him a look. "Shut up." As he walked out of the precinct, heading for his car, something unfamiliar settled in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change. And so was Rex's. The shelter smelled of antiseptic and damp fur, the air thick with the sharp echoes of barking dogs. Mark had been in plenty of rough places before. Crime scenes, rundown alleys, places that made his stomach turn. But this felt different. This wasn't violence. This was abandonment. He walked past rows of kennels, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. Dogs jumped at the bars, tails wagging, paws scraping, all eager for attention. He barely glanced at them. He wasn't here for just any dog. "Back here," a woman said, leading him toward the farthest row of kennels. She was the shelter manager, her voice soft but tinged with something wary, like she didn't expect this visit to end well. "He doesn't do much anymore. Won't interact with people. We've tried." Mark didn't answer. And then he saw him. Rex. The German Shepherd was curled up in the corner of his kennel, his back against the cold metal bars, his head resting on his paws. He didn't jump up like the others. He didn't whine or beg for attention. He just existed, his body still but not relaxed. Mark knew that posture. He had seen it before, in soldiers, in cops, in himself. Then Rex's ears twitched. It was slight. Barely a movement, but it was there. His body tensed just enough to be noticeable. And then slowly, he lifted his head. Mark stood still as Rex's eyes met his. For the first time in weeks, the dog focused on something. Not just an empty glance, not the hollow stare of an animal going through the motions. This was different. This was recognition. Not of Mark himself, but of something familiar. The uniform, the way he carried himself, the unspoken authority in his stance. Mark crouched, resting his forearms on his knees, meeting Rex's gaze without speaking. The shelter worker stood beside him, silent, watching. Rex didn't move closer, didn't wag his tail, didn't soften, but he didn't look away either. "That's the first time I've seen him react to anyone," the woman murmured. Mark reached out, palm up, not forcing the movement, just letting Rex see, letting him decide. Rex didn't come forward, but his nose twitched. His body didn't fully relax, but something in his eyes shifted. He was waiting. For what, Mark didn't know. But something told him he had to find out. The air inside the shelter felt heavier now. Mark could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. Workers, volunteers, even the other dogs, watching, waiting to see if he would be just another person who walked away. The shelter manager shifted beside him, arms crossed. I need to be honest with you, she said, her voice careful. Rex doesn't trust easily. Not anymore. We've had trainers come in, officers, even experienced handlers. He won't engage, won't take treats, won't respond to commands. It's like he shut down the day he was left here. Mark barely acknowledged her words, his focus locked on Rex. He had seen this kind of silence before. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind built from loss. The kind that settled in after too many goodbyes, after realizing that waiting for someone to return was pointless. But Rex had reacted to him. That meant something. Mark lowered himself into a crouch, resting his forearms on his knees, making himself smaller, less imposing. His movements were slow, deliberate. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but firm. "Hey, boy." Rex's ears twitched. Mark didn't rush it. He didn't reach out, didn't force the moment. He just let his voice fill the space between them, steady and certain. "I know you've been waiting," he said, his tone holding no pity, just understanding. "I know this isn't where you're supposed to be." Rex didn't move, but his eyes locked onto Mark's with sharp focus. "You're not forgotten," Mark continued. "Not anymore." There was no grand moment, no sudden spark of recognition, but something shifted. Rex's body, once rigid, loosened just a fraction. It wasn't submission. It wasn't surrender. It was something harder to earn. It was consideration. Mark slowly extended his hand, palm up, keeping it steady in the space between them. No commands, no coaxing, just an offer. The room felt silent despite the distant barking of other dogs. The shelter manager didn't say a word. No one moved. And then finally, after weeks of lying motionless, after months of ignoring every outstretched hand, Rex took a step forward. It was small, cautious, but it was there. And then another. Mark didn't move, didn't react, barely breathed as Rex closed the distance. The dog's nose twitched, taking in his scent, gathering whatever information he needed. And then, after one long moment, Rex pressed his head against Mark's hand. A deep, quiet exhale escaped from Mark's chest. The shelter worker blinked, stunned. I've never seen him do that." Mark didn't answer, because at that moment, words didn't matter. What mattered was that Rex had made a choice, and Mark wasn't about to let him regret it. The pen felt heavier than it should have as Mark signed his name on the adoption papers. His signature scrawled across the page, sealing the decision, making the promise real. He glanced up, watching Rex through the glass window of the office. The dog sat still, his posture strong, but his eyes wary, as if he wasn't quite sure what was happening yet. The shelter manager slid the papers back across the desk, her expression softer than before. "You sure about this?" she asked, not in doubt, but in the way someone does when they know what a commitment like this means. Mark exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said, the weight of the words settling in his chest. "I'm sure." He had walked into this shelter thinking he'd just take a look, just see for himself. But that wasn't how this worked. It had never been just a look. From the moment Rex had lifted his head, from the moment he had pressed it against Mark's hand, something had shifted. Rex had made a choice, and now Mark had made his. The kennel door creaked open as the shelter worker unclipped the latch. Rex stepped forward cautiously, his body tense, but he didn't hesitate. His sharp amber eyes flickered up to Mark, watching, waiting. Mark knelt, steady and calm, holding out the leash. "You ready, partner?" Rex's ears twitched at the word. For the first time in weeks, he took a step forward on his own. Not because he was being told, not because he had no other choice, but because something in him recognized that this moment was different. Mark stood, gripping the leash loosely, not leading but walking in sync as they moved toward the exit. The shelter door groaned open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Rex felt fresh air against his fur without the barrier of metal bars. He paused at the threshold. For just a second, he turned his head, glancing back at the rows of kennels, at the place where he had spent too many nights waiting for someone who never came. Then just as quickly, he looked forward again and stepped through the door. The parking lot was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow across the pavement. Mark opened the passenger side of his truck, patting the seat. "Hop in." Rex hesitated. Then after a beat, he jumped. Mark shut the door, circling to the driver's side, settling in beside him. For the first time since he walked into that shelter, Mark let himself smile. He reached over, giving Rex a firm pat on the side. "Let's go home." And just like that, a new beginning started. The drive home was quiet. The low hum of the truck's engine filled the space between them, but neither Mark nor Rex made a sound. Mark kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the center console. Every so often, he glanced at the dog beside him. Rex sat rigid in the passenger seat, his sharp eyes scanning the world outside. His ears twitched at passing cars, his body tensing at the distant wail of a siren. He was still wired, still waiting for orders, still trying to understand where he was supposed to be. Mark understood. When they pulled into the driveway, Mark turned off the engine but didn't move. "All right, partner," he said, his voice steady. "We're home." Rex didn't react. Not yet. Mark stepped out, opening the passenger door. Rex hesitated, staring at the open space beyond the truck. His muscles coiled, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Mark didn't rush him. He simply stepped back, hands resting at his sides. After a long moment, Rex jumped down. His paws hit the gravel with precision, his head snapping up, eyes darting around, assessing, scanning. The old habits were still there. Mark led him inside, keeping his steps slow, controlled. "Come on, boy." Rex followed, but with hesitation. Every corner of the house was a new challenge, a new unknown. His paws slid against the hardwood floors at first, his tail low, uncertain. Mark knelt beside him. "This is your home now. No bars, no cages." Rex's ears flicked forward. That first night was restless. Rex didn't lie down. He didn't curl up in the bed Mark had set out for him. Instead, he paced, slow, deliberate circles around the living room, pausing at the front door, sniffing, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Mark let him. The second night was the same. The third night, something changed. Mark was in the kitchen pouring himself a cup of coffee when he heard it. A small sound, so quiet he barely caught it. A tail, wagging. He turned slowly, careful not to break the moment. Rex was still standing, but his posture was looser, his head slightly tilted. His tail, stiff and unmoving since the day they met, gave the smallest, cautious wag. Mark crouched. "Good boy." Rex stepped forward. Not much, just a few inches, but it was enough. Mark let out a slow breath. They were getting there. One step at a time. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that came with settling into something new. Mark sat on the couch, nursing a cup of coffee, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. Rex lay nearby, his body stretched out on the rug, but his ears twitched at every distant sound. He was always listening, always watching. Mark had noticed the changes. The dog who once paced through the night had started lying down more, easing into the routine of civilian life. But the sharpness, the instinct, that would never fade. Then the phone rang. Mark sat up, setting his mug down. It was late, too late for anything good. He grabbed his phone, answering in a low voice. "Callahan." "Mark, we got a situation," came the voice on the other end, his old partner Grant. "A kid's gone missing, 5 years old. Family reported him missing from their backyard an hour ago. No leads yet. It's bad." Mark was already standing, his mind shifting gears. "Where?" "West Side, near Oak Ridge. We're sending out search teams, but—" Grant hesitated. "Look, I know you've got experience with K9s. We could use a set of trained eyes." Mark glanced down. Rex was already on his feet. The dog's ears were perked, his eyes locked onto Mark's face. He knew. Mark didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." Rex didn't need to be told. He followed Mark to the door, his steps quick, precise. The hesitation from weeks ago was gone. This was something he understood. The mission, the call to action. Mark grabbed his jacket, clipping Rex's leash onto his collar, though he knew he wouldn't need it. "You still got it in you, partner?" Rex's tail didn't wag, but there was something in his stance. A shift in energy, an old fire rekindled. They drove through the darkened streets, the weight of urgency pressing down. Mark didn't talk much, but he could feel it, Rex knew. His head was high, his nose twitching, his body still and alert beside Mark in the truck. When they pulled up to the scene, flashing lights painted the night in red and blue. Officers moved in clusters, talking to frantic parents, organizing search teams. Mark barely had the truck in park before Rex let out a low, eager whine. Grant met him at the edge of the driveway, his eyes flicking down to the dog. "You sure about this?" Mark tightened his grip on the leash. "He is." And just like that, they were back in it. The cold night air pressed heavy against Mark's skin as he crouched beside Rex, his grip firm on the leash, but loose enough to let the dog take the lead. The yard was damp, the grass trampled from the search teams that had already scoured the area. But Mark knew better. If there was one thing he had learned in all his years, it was that human eyes missed what a K9 never would. Rex's nose was low to the ground, his body tense with focus. Mark could feel it, the shift, the energy, the moment instincts took over. Grant stood a few feet away, arms crossed. "Search teams already covered this block," he said, voice low. Mark didn't take his eyes off Rex. "Not like this, they didn't." And then it happened. Rex froze. His ears snapped forward, nostrils flaring as he inhaled deep, sharp breaths. Then without warning, he moved. Fast. Mark barely had time to react before Rex took off, his powerful muscles surging forward as he pulled against the leash. Mark didn't stop him. He ran with him, his own heart pounding with adrenaline as they cut across the yard and toward the dense woods behind the house. "Callahan!" Grant shouted after him, but Mark didn't stop. Rex was locked in. The brush was thick, branches clawing at Mark's sleeves as he pushed through, his pulse hammering in his ears. But Rex moved like he had never left the field. Every step was purposeful, every pause calculated. Then the dog let out a sharp, urgent bark. Mark's stomach clenched. "What is it, boy?" Rex lunged forward, nearly dragging Mark with him, his paws digging into the earth as he reached a small clearing just beyond the trees. And there, huddled beneath a fallen log, his small face streaked with tears, was the boy. Mark's breath caught. The child sniffled, curling in on himself, eyes wide with fear. His clothes were damp, his small hands clutched tightly around a toy car. Rex didn't hesitate. He moved forward but slow, his ears relaxed, his tail still, a calming presence. The boy stared at the dog, his lips trembling. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, "Doggy?" Mark exhaled, his chest tight with relief. "Yeah, kid, he found you." Behind him, he heard voices, officers pushing through the brush, Grant calling his name. But all he could focus on was Rex, standing firm beside the boy, his job done. For the first time in a long time, the dog who had been left behind was a hero once more. The drive back was silent, but not the heavy kind. This was something different, something lighter, something right. Mark's knuckles were tight on the steering wheel, his heart still racing from the night's events. He kept glancing at the passenger seat, where Rex sat, his body finally relaxed, his head slightly tilted as he watched the world pass by through the window. He was calm, but his eyes still carried that quiet alertness, the same sharpness he had when they first met. Mark exhaled slowly. "You knew, didn't you?" Rex flicked an ear but didn't move otherwise. "You knew the second we got there," Mark continued, shaking his head. "You didn't forget, not for a second." It wasn't just instinct, it wasn't just training, it was purpose. By the time they pulled into the driveway, Rex had started to show signs of exhaustion. His body was strong, but Mark knew what a long night like this could do to even the toughest dogs. He opened the truck door, unclipping the leash, but Rex didn't bolt ahead like he had at the scene. Instead, he stepped down slowly, waiting, walking side by side with Mark toward the house. Inside, Mark tossed his keys onto the counter, rubbing a hand down his face. He was bone-tired, but there was something about knowing the kid was safe, knowing that Rex had done something no one else could, that made the exhaustion worth it. He turned, expecting to see Rex pacing like before, still unsure of his new home. But he wasn't. Rex had already settled onto the rug near the couch, his body stretched out, his head resting on his paws. For the first time since he left that shelter, he looked at peace. Mark walked over, crouching beside him, running a hand down the dog's thick fur. Rex didn't move, but his tail thumped once against the floor. "You're not just some retired K9, are you?" Mark murmured. Another slow tail thump. Mark smirked. "Didn't think so." He sat down beside Rex, leaning back against the couch, the weight of the day pressing against him. The world had tried to forget about this dog, tried to push him aside like he had no more use, like his loyalty didn't matter. But Rex had proven them all wrong. He wasn't just a partner, he was family. And as the night stretched on, as Mark drifted into sleep with his best friend lying beside him, one thing became clear. Rex was home, and this time, no one was ever going to take him away again. Some stories aren't just about heroes, they're about second chances. Rex was left behind, forgotten, but when the world turned its back on him, one man stepped forward. And in the end, Rex proved what we already knew. Loyalty never fades, and true partners never stop protecting the ones they love. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of second chances and the unbreakable bond between a K9 and his handler, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and share this story with someone who understands the loyalty of a dog. Because heroes like Rex deserve to be remembered. And with your support, we can continue telling stories that honor their courage. Stay tuned for more incredible tales of loyalty, bravery, and the partnerships that change lives.